Hello and welcome to online lecture 13. We're going to be talking about reliability and validity today. So reliability and validity are really measures of how well your measure works. So we're going to talk about both concepts, and they both will tell you how well something actually measures your construct, your concept of interest. Okay, so let's start off with some definitions. Okay. Reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency or stability of the scores you test. Assessment, raters, etc. Okay, so in other words, how good is your test at being consistent or stable? Okay, and we can also talk about the same about raters. Are raters stable? Are raters consistent with each other? Okay. Whereas validity refers to the extent to which your measurement procedure is measuring what you think it is measuring and whether you have interpreted your scores correctly. So let's talk about this notion of reliability and validity, because the thing is, you can have reliability without validity, but you can't have validity without reliability. So why is that the case? Well, let's consider a scale, okay? Scale that measures weight. And on this scale, you notice that one time you get on and it measures 120. Another time you get on and it measures 150. And a third time you get on and it measures 100. Wow, that's not reliable at all. Okay, and we'll assume that you did this on 3 consecutive days, so your weight couldn't have possibly changed that much. So that's not reliable. And if it's not reliable, if it's not consistent, how could it even begin to be valid? How could it even begin to be a truthful measure of your weight? On the other hand, you could have something that is reliable but not valid. Consider a stopped watch. Okay? Let's say your watch stopped and it always measures 11 a.m. That's very reliable. That's very, very consistent, but it's not valid. It's not accurate. At least it's not accurate most of the time. It's accurate once a day at 11 a.m. Okay. So a measure must be reliable in order to be valid, but a reliable measure is not necessarily valid. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about types of reliability, because there are many different ways to get at reliability. Some types are better than others depending on what you're measuring. Test-retest reliability. This is consistency of individual scores over time. So in other words, you give someone a test. Let's say we wait a month, and then we give them the same test. And what we see if we have test-retest reliability is that those scores should be very, very similar. Now, if you have an intelligence test, which is a relatively stable construct, right, for most of us, that stays pretty much the same, that should work well. Then test-retest reliability is a good kind of reliability to use. However, consider for a moment, what if you didn't have something like what if you didn't have something like an intelligence test? What if you had a measure of mood? Well, that would be really a poor choice to use test-retest reliability to assess the reliability of your mood measure, right? Because mood changes from day to day. Today I'm in a great mood, tomorrow I'm in a not so great mood, right? So that wouldn't work out too well. So in that case, maybe we would have something like equivalent forms reliability. This would be consistency of scores on 2 versions of a test. Now, the SAT is a perfect example of this because, as you know, not everyone gets the same exact questions on an SAT, but they are supposed to be equivalently difficult. So even though you're not having the same exact questions, they should still be reliable. So if you take one version of the SAT and then you take another version of the SAT, your scores should be quite similar. Internal consistency reliability. This is the consistency with which items on a test measure a single construct. So let's consider depressive items on a scale, right? Depressive items on a scale should hopefully all get at the same construct of depression. In fact, there's something called split half within internal consistency reliability, which actually, sorry about that, which actually splits the items in half, and then you can compare both halves. So if we had, let's say, a 50 item measure of depression, we might compare the odd responses to the depression items, right? 1, 3, 5, to the even numbers. And hopefully the two depression scores that we get out of that should come out relatively the same. And again, that's called split half. Okay. So now we can talk about inter-rater reliability, which is the degree of agreement between two or more observers or raters. It can be really difficult to get at inter-rater reliability. So let's say you have two different people observing aggressive behavior on a playground. Imagine for a moment that they both see something that occurs between two kids. Will both of them rate it the same way? Will they rate it at the same level of aggression? Will they both see the same thing? Right? And so you might want to train them and come up with very detailed behaviors so that they can be more consistent and reliable in their measures. Another big area where this comes up is in diagnosis. Okay, psychiatric diagnosis, in particular mental health diagnosis. It can be very difficult sometimes for different raters, even different psychologists or psychiatrists, to come up with the same diagnosis. And that's why I think that the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, has become more specific than certainly at the beginning when we were at DSM-1. It's become more specific as we have graduated toward DSM-5 to try to help us have better reliability. Okay, so that's pretty much the different kinds of reliability you can use and some examples of where you might use each one. Now let's talk about validity. Remember, this is how accurately a measure measures a construct. Okay, so the accuracy of the inferences, interpretations, or actions made on the basis of any measurement. Okay, so we want to make sure that when we're measuring something, we're getting a true measure of it. Now again, this can be a bit simpler with something like weight, right? And a lot more complicated when it comes to depressive symptomatology. Okay. So let's start by talking about construct validity. And construct validity, you can think of sort of as this overall notion of validity. And what we're asking here is, do operational definitions accurately represent the construct we are interested in? So when we're measuring depression, are we measuring all those little operational definitions that we talked about before, all the breakdowns of depression accurately? Okay. So within construct validity now, we're going to talk about different kinds of specific validities. And again, some of them are more appropriate than others depending on the situation. So the first one is face validity. Face validity, it looks right. Depression scale should include items about sadness, not when you learn to ride a bicycle. So does the content of the measure appear to reflect the construct being measured? Okay. Now, again, this works very well with certain scales. Like most depression scales you will look at will probably have face validity. But if you consider the MMPI, which is a very known, very well validated scale of personality, it actually measures depression too, but it doesn't really look that face valid. You wouldn't guess what it's measuring just by reading the items. Okay. The next one is content validity. Does the content of the measure linked to the universe of content that defines the construct? Is the content of the measure linked to the universe of content that defines the construct? In other words, in this case, you might look and see that a depression scale contains each of the DSM-5 depressive symptoms. Okay, so the content should match what we're trying to get at. Okay. So content, before I go on to predictive, I just want to share with you that content and face are similar, but not exactly the same, right? You could still have content without being able to immediately have that face validity of saying, oh yeah, this definitely measures depression. Okay. They're similar though. Predictive validity. Scores on the measure predict behavior on a criterion measured at a time in the future. So for those of you who are thinking about grad school, maybe you're thinking about taking the GRE or the LSAT or the MCAT even, right? And when you were thinking about college, you were probably thinking about the SAT or something similar. These are all tests that are designed to hopefully predict behavior at some time in the future, right? So when you take a GRE, the whole reason for this test is to predict how well you will perform in grad school. And that's the idea of it, right? And we hope that it does a good job. Okay. Next, when we talk about concurrent validity, we are talking about scores on the measure that are related to a criterion measured at the same time. Okay, so concurrent, we said, now this is similar, but it's at the same time. So now let's consider you're trying to measure shyness. And you're going to have people, salespersons, make cold calls to potential customers. Well, those who are more shy will probably score lower on how they do with these cold calls. Okay? Could be something else. Anything that you're measuring at the same time that you're looking to see if it's measuring the right criterion. Okay. Next, convergent validity. Scores on the measure are related to other measures of the same construct. So in other words, we happen to know that shyness and social anxiety are highly correlated. They're highly related. So if you measure shyness and you have an already known, already validated measure of social anxiety, those two should correlate. Those two should be related. Scores should be similar. Those who are higher on one should be higher on the other. On the other hand, we have discriminant validity, where scores on the measure are not related to other measures that are theoretically different. So now if we measure shyness and we measure knowledge about automobiles, those two should not be correlated or related, right? There's nothing that we know about that should mean that those two should actually line up. That would be discriminant validity. Now for that might seem kind of silly. Of course, shyness and and automobiles have nothing to do with each other. Why should they be the same? But let's consider if you were trying to do a very specific measure of depression. You might not want it to correlate too highly with a measure of anxiety. Even though we know that those two symptom patterns can overlap, we might want to really distinguish one from the other, tease them apart. So we might want to have some discriminant validity there. Okay. So using reliability and validity information, how do we use this information? Well, the way it works is, let's pretend you are creating a new measure right now. In fact, I've been working on a new measure. I've been working on a measure about malingering or faking bad on a test. Okay? And this is an important concept that we need measured well in our field. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to gather a norming group. This would just be a reference group upon which my reported reliability and validity and evidence would be based. Okay, so let's take another construct just for a moment, like depression. You want to create a new measure of depression. So what you have to do is you have to figure out how people who are not depressed score on your measure, and how people who are reporting depressive symptomatology score on your measure. Then you would have a good, and if you do this, you want to do this for a very large group typically, right? Let's say you do this for 10,000 people. That might be your norming group. That might be your reference group. And then when you use this test again, you can compare scores to your norming group. Okay. Now let's talk just a little bit about sources of information about tests. Okay, so there are a number of places you can get information about tests. So again, let's say you come across and you say, hey, I want to use the Beck Depression Inventory. Well, I'd like you to actually report some reliability and validity information about that if that's what you want to use for your study. So where can you find that reliability and validity information? Lots of places. For example, the Mental Measurements Yearbook with tests in print. HAPI, which is the Health and Psychosocial Instruments Database. PsycInfo, PsycArticles, Medline, PubMed. There's a lot of places where if you look up the Beck Depression Inventory, you can find reliability and validity information to report. Okay. Sometimes it's in the article that you read about. So let's say you were reading, you want to study depression in college students, you have a particular study that you've set up around this, and now you want to measure that depressive symptomatology. You happen to see in another article they used the Beck Depression Inventory, but maybe they didn't report their reliability and validity information there. Well, where are you going to find that? Look up the Beck Depression Inventory in PsycInfo or in HAPI, and you should be able to find information about the reliability and validity of this instrument. It's a very well-known instrument. Okay. All right. So that's all I have for you today about reliability and validity. We will continue with part 2 of validity next time we talk. In the meantime, stay well, be safe, and I'll talk to you next time.